And so just kind of to recap really that dramatic impact of this rule, USCIS is looking to predict whether or not someone in the future is going to need public benefits, and how do they predict that? That's essentially what the totality of circumstances test is all about. It's not so much current use of benefits, it's are you in the future likely to need these benefits for this set time period? So how do they make this prediction? And that's where this totality of circumstances test comes into play. This is where they are going to look at now the age, the health status of the individual applying for a green card, their family status, what's their financial history like, what is their education and skill level, and much, much more. And it's all of these factors which they have now weighted in terms of heavily negative, heavily positive, to determine the totality of circumstances and whether or not someone is likely to be a public charge. So what are these factors? So when we think about the totality of circumstances test, these are some of the things. And you will notice a theme that many of these factors relate to the person's ability to be employed. So age. What they have spelled out in the rule is that immigrants who are under age 18 or over age 61, that's likely to be negative factors against them because they consider those age groups apparently less likely to be able to work or to find work. So that sounds a little bit like age discrimination, doesn't it? But that is kind of what they have spelled out in their criteria. Education and skills. They are going to look at the immigrant and application and see whether or not they have any special training, special licensing. Is it someone with a skill level that is very much needed in our workforce in the United States? Or is it someone who maybe doesn't have a formal education? They will also now consider the person's ability to read, write, and speak English. That will now be a factor to consider. And if not, that might be a negative factor when it comes to this test. They now look at a person's health status. They always do a health screening, but now they're really looking at it in terms of, do they have a health condition that will prevent the immigrant from working? They will look at whether or not it's a condition that is costly to treat and whether or not that person has the means to cover their healthcare costs. Family status. The rule states that larger households are disfavored, and so the size of someone's family may be a negative factor when it comes to the totality of circumstances. Income and financial status is also a significant consideration. So households who have an income that is under 125% of the federal poverty level, that will be a negative factor for their green card application. Now, if their income is over 250% FPL, that actually is a heavily positive weighted factor. So that's, an area where an immigrant or the immigrant family can actually make some, I guess you could say it's a positive factor, so they could make some headway there with their application. Credit history or their credit score is now a factor. And, if it's an immigrant who's new to the United States, they may not have a credit history here. And then you can see some of the other factors related to income and financial status listed here on this slide. I mentioned earlier the affidavit of support, which is what the sponsor signs and attests to that they will essentially be financially responsible for the immigrant who is seeking entry or seeking to become a green card holder. It is still required, but whereas in the past this was a pretty significant part of the public charge assessment and was sufficient to approve an application. Now it's just one of several factors to consider. And immigration officials can really look at this sponsor and the affidavit of support and consider not just the sponsor's income, but the relationship to the person seeking a green card and whether or not that sponsor is sponsoring other individuals. So it's, again, not sufficient on its own any longer. So these are the heavily weighted negative factors, whereas if the immigrant, is not employed, doesn't have any employment lined up, or they have used benefits, or they have a costly medical condition, or they've had a prior finding of inadmissibility, these are all considered heavily weighted negative factors. And it is not clear to immigrant advocates as to whether or not how positive factors will outweigh the negative factors. We're just really not sure how immigration officials are going to kind of apply that yet. These are the heavily weighted positive factors. So I already mentioned, the 250% or higher income. If they have a work permit and they're able to demonstrate that they have employment, that will be a positive factor, as well as unsubsidized private health insurance. So how do they document all of this, right? How do they document all of these factors that immigration officials are going to need to assess? This is now being done on what's known as the I-944 form, or Declaration of Self-Sufficiency form. It is more like a booklet than a form. It's 18 pages long, and the instructions alone are 16 pages long. But this form is what is used to really show their financial history, their work history, their skills, their whether or not they've applied for benefits, and much, much more. So when someone is now submitting a green card application, they must submit this form as well. You can find the form on the USCIS website if you would like to take a look at what they're asking. And it is in effect. It went into use on February 24th, 2020. So the questions, just kind of to sum up kind of all of this so far, the questions that immigrants are asking is, well, if I use benefits, am I going to be determined a public charge? And I hope that by viewing this presentation, you now have a greater understanding that it's not just use of benefits, right? It's all of those totality of circumstances. So just because someone used benefits does not automatically make someone a public charge. They're now looking at all of these different factors. And it's looking at their overall circumstances to look to the future, right? To look prospectively. So no one factor is going to make someone a public charge. It's kind of the totality of it all.